Welcome to the Christian Concept Sunday School lesson, where we study with the International Sunday School Lesson Commentary. Our focus this week is in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 through 27, and then including verses 30 and 31. The title is Disciples Believe the Resurrection, and I'm your host, Dr. Christie Solomon. There are two goals for you to achieve this week. One, you should be able to summarize the conversation that took place on the road to Emmaus, and then to compare and contrast the disciples' experiences of Jesus when they did not, and then when they did recognize him. The outline is divided into three sections. Section 1, we're going to focus on how the journey begins, and that's covering verses 13 through 16. Part A of Section 1, we read about the distressed feeling by Jesus' death, and that's verses 13 and 14. And then Part B, they are joined by Jesus, and that's introduced to us in verses 15 and 16. Section 2 outline is covering verses 17 through 24, and we're focusing on their lament as travelers. Part A covers verses 17 through 21, and they're indicating their despair of hearing that news as they talk. And then Part B, they are admitting some skepticism, and that's covering in verses 22 through 24. Section 3 of the outline, we want to focus on verses 25 through 27, and then the last two verses, 30 and 31 of our lesson. And we will focus on their response to Jesus. Part A, covering verses 25, 26, and 27, Jesus has to correct their thinking and give them some update in teaching them what happened from Moses to now about him in the prophecy. And Part B, it's the revealing meal as he goes and eats with them, and that's again covered in verses 30 to 31. And so our contextual background should give you some insights on what's going on at this point of our lesson. Well, we know that there's at least 3 women who had already went to the tomb and discovered it to be empty. There were people and some disciples who discussed this miracle and the consequences and the future potential impact from the Roman governments for them individually and as a group of followers of Jesus Christ. We know that not all Jews believed in Jesus' resurrection, and that some of Jesus' own followers, though they were skeptical about this empty tomb, would not have entirely denied the possibility that this occurred. And we always like to include a visual for those of you who like to have those specifics and those particulars more concrete for your understanding. This is credited to courtesy of the Lumo Project, that we want to make sure that we share for their proper credit and use of their information for our Sunday School lesson today. Now, the same day that the tomb of Jesus was found empty, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village called Emmaus. It was a walk of around 7 miles or 10 kilometers from Jerusalem. They were discussing the recent events that had happened in Jerusalem. As they talked, Jesus came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" Jesus asked. They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, called Cleopas, replied, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know what has happened there in the last 2 days what things Jesus asked. What things Jesus asked? About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in all he said and did. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to save Israel. It is now the 3rd day since all this took place. Then today, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it empty, just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures about himself, the Messiah. As they approached Emmaus, Jesus continued on as if he was going further, but they insisted, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When Jesus was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks. Jesus broke it and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized Jesus. He instantly disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning while he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned immediately to Jerusalem. They found the 11 disciples and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on their trip and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Here are your scriptures from the New International Version. Verse 13. That same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and deliberated, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. Verse 16, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Verse 17, he asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stood still with sadness on their faces. Verse 18, one of them named Cleopas asked him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that had happened there in recent days. Verse 19, what things, he asked. The events involving Jesus of Nazareth, they answered. This man was a prophet, powerful in speech and action before God and all the people. Verse 20, our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to the sentence of death, and they crucified him. Verse 21, but we were hoping he was the one who would redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is the third day since these things took place. Verse 22, furthermore, some of our women astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning. Verse 23, but they did not find his body. They came and told us they had seen a vision of angels who said that Jesus was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had described, but him they did not see. Verse 25, then Jesus said to them, O foolish one, how slow are your hearts to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Verse 26, was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then to enter his glory? Verse 27, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was written in all the scriptures about himself. Verse 28, as they approached the village where they were headed, he seemed to be going farther. Verse 29, but they pleaded with him, stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over. Verse 30, while he was reclining at the table with them, he took bread, spoke a blessing, and broke it, and gave it to them. Verse 31, then their eyes were opened, and they recognized Jesus, and he disappeared from their sight. These have been your verses for this lesson on the disciples believe in this resurrection. So in conclusion, we've read that the travelers in today's lesson experienced a resurrection revolution that led to their own personal revolution, as well as that their saddened outlook was transformed when they shared this meal with the resurrected Lord, and he taught them so many things about what the prophecy said, as well as this revolution brought them new joy, new enthusiasm, and peace. This resurrection also meant there was a focus of reordered priorities, a clarity of his teachings, and then a reference back to the Old Testament scriptures that pointed to these actual transformative events. And then finally, Jesus' resurrection has impacted the world and brought celebration, connection for 7 billion Christians today. That includes you and I. And here are a few lesson insights on a couple of verses that we hope you've achieved in this study. In verse 19, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, the men explained what they did know about Jesus. And they knew his name and where Jesus was from. They knew that he was a prophet. They knew he was mighty in deed and word. They knew he was crucified. They knew he promised to redeem Israel and that he rose from the dead, as others have said. Lesson insights from verse 13. These men were common, simple men. They had lost hope. They had lost joy, which was their sense of spiritual desertion. They had not lost their desire because they still loved to talk about Jesus. They still did not see yet the necessity of him going to the cross. And here are some lesson insights from verse 27. Jesus told them, according to the Old Testament, their Messiah was him, and the connection was from when he was the seed of the woman whose heel was bruised, mentioned earlier in the gospel, in the Old Testament. The blessing of Abraham to all nations, still speaking about him. That the Messiah was the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. That the Messiah was the man who wrestled with Jacob. He was the lion of the tribe of Judah. He was the voice from the burning bush. He was the Passover lamb. He was the prophet greater than Moses and the captain of the Lord's army to Joshua. He was also the ultimate kinsman. That was the Redeemer mentioned in Ruth. The Messiah was the son of David, who was a king greater than David. He is the suffering Savior of Psalms 22, the Good Shepherd of Psalms 23, the wisdom of Proverbs, and the lover of the Song of Solomon. The Messiah is the Savior described in the prophets and the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, and the princely Messiah of Daniel, who would establish a kingdom that would never end. This has been your Sunday School lesson, Disciples Believe the Resurrection, focusing again chapter 24 of Luke as we studied the first 12 last week. We are focusing again today, and now some of the disciples believed, some did not. Part of this study should give you some insights as to how all of this took place as God had ordained for the resurrection to be such a mammoth aspect of life, transformative to say the least, so that today, 2023, 7 billion men and women who've accepted Christ as their Savior and are now called Christians, following after the teachings of Christ, are those who believe him today, all leading up, of course, in this road to resurrection. If you like us, just give us a thumbs up, share this with your friends and family, leave us a comment if you choose to, and consider subscribing. We hope that God will continue to press upon you to continue to study to show yourself approved. And until we study with you again, may the peace and prosperity and all fulfilled promises meet you and your family at your door, and that God will continue to allow you to feel his presence in everything you do. I'm Dr. Christie Solomon.